Welcome to the #1 video on YouTube to learn modern JavaScript. This video is for beginners to go from nothing to learning the essential JavaScript concepts. Now, very quickly before we jump into it, why should you even learn JavaScript? Well, maybe you've seen the insane salary and job growth. It's very common to see six-figure salaries for JavaScript developers in the United States. But everywhere, globally, the job market for JavaScript developers is absolutely exploding. And the reason for this is that the economy keeps moving to the web. Now, you would think that we are already very deep into the digital transition, but if you look at data, for example, e-commerce data, you can see that a huge part of transactions are still offline, right? So this will all come to the web. We're still at the beginning of the digital transition. So there will be a lot more demand for more websites and more web apps. And this all has to be built by web developers, people like you. And the programming language of the web is, of course, JavaScript. That's why it's exploding, and that's why there has never been a better time to learn JavaScript than right now. Now, also, if you want to become competent in any of the popular frameworks like React, Angular, Vue, or Node.js, you need to master JavaScript because these frameworks are all built on JavaScript, right? So in this video, you'll see many JavaScript concepts that you will need in those frameworks. Now, what is JavaScript? What is this ES6 thing? Well, the technical standard is actually called EcmaScript, or ES for short. It's maintained by an organization called Ecma International, and browsers try to implement this standard, and the actual implementation is what we call JavaScript. Now, every year there is a new edition of EcmaScript. In 2015, the 6th edition ES6 was released, and this was actually a huge update. Usually these new editions are not very interesting. You don't even hear about them because usually every year it's only like a small edition. But with ES6, this was a huge update, and everything since then is what people generally refer to as modern JavaScript. Now, the video that you're about to watch is actually a highly rated video from my professional JavaScript course. In the background here, you can actually see the projects from that course. This video received so many positive reviews telling me that they learned so much that I decided to just make this publicly available for free on YouTube. So enjoy and really try to make it all the way to the end. It's really worth it because JavaScript can be a little bit intimidating, and the only way to get rid of that intimidating feeling is to actually become competent at JavaScript. And this video will help you a ton with that. Now, very quickly, these are the critical concepts for modern JavaScript developers. This is what you will learn in this video, and don't worry if you've never seen any of this before. We will start from absolute scratch, but I just quickly want to give you an overview. So we're going to learn about variables. So we had var in the past, and these days you should use let or const. We'll talk about data types and structures. That means strings, numbers, booleans, arrays, object. We'll talk about string concatenation. We used to use the plus sign for this, but these days we also have something called template literals with backticks. We'll talk about traditional functions versus arrow functions. Don't worry if you don't know what a function is, we'll talk all about that, but I just quickly want to show you what the evolution here is basically. So this was the old school way of doing it, and now we can write these arrow functions, right? So we have like this arrow, this symbol here, right? And this will look very strange, by the way. If you happen to already know a little bit about JavaScript and you're used to this will look very strange to you, but don't worry, once you get used to it, you'll see that this is a much better syntax. There's also some innovation for if-else statements. We still use if-else, but now we also have the ternary operator. Maybe you've seen that before with a question mark and then a colon. Now, we also need to know about events and how to manipulate the HTML and CSS. This is actually one of the reasons that JavaScript exists in the first place, because let's say that a user clicks on something, on a button, and we want to change the HTML in reaction to that, right? We can do that with JavaScript, right? And you'll see many concepts that you're gonna need in React or Node.js and so on. All right, that's everything I had to say. Let's get into the actual video. Enjoy. Now, I recommend that you do not code along with me here because I want you to be 100% focused on what I have to say, right? So then in project 1, you can start coding along with me, right? So this is just gonna be a quick demonstration. All right, so here on the left side, I have my code editor, which is gonna be Visual Studio Code. On the right-hand side, I have Chrome. Now, in Visual Studio Code, the way it works is you have to open a folder, right? So you do not have to do this. Again, do not code along with me here. I'm just saying how it works. You can open a folder and you can create new files in the folder that you opened. You can even create new folders in the folder. Now, this is a JavaScript course, but the story actually starts with HTML, because when I type a website, an address here in the address bar of my browser, for example, airbnb.com, If I would press enter here, the browser will send a network request to the server of Airbnb, and the first file that we get back here, right, from that network request, the network response will actually be an HTML file. It will not be a JavaScript file, right? So even if you create a React app or a Vue app or an Angular app where we basically code in JavaScript almost 100% of the time, you may be surprised to hear that HTML is actually still, you could say, the entry point of the website or web app, right? So the first file that we get back is an HTML file, right? So that's really where the story still starts in web development. So I'm going to create a new HTML file here. I'm going to call it index.html. Why index? This is a bit of a remnant from the past, I guess. There's no particular reason. This is just a common way that people call HTML files. As long as the extension is HTML, the browser will understand what to do with it. So in Visual Studio Code, there is a built-in functionality called emmet, and emmet helps us out. So for example, when I type HTML, emmet actually gives us some options. Now I want a second option here, and if I press tab, it will actually give me an HTML boilerplate, right? So I'm showing you this because one of the main purposes of JavaScript is to manipulate the HTML, as we'll see. So we do need to understand a little bit about HTML as well, right? So HTML, it has this doc type declaration indicating that it's an HTML document. We have this HTML element, and then we have the head and body, right? Head is for meta information. The body is for you could say the actual content, what we actually want to display on the screen. So in the head tag, we have these three meta tags. Well, this is for the character set. This one has to do with Internet Explorer, and this one is important for responsiveness, right? So we don't want to change this. If you want to learn more about that, well, it's not part of the course, but you can Google that. So I'm going to add some space here. Actually, let me change the title here. I'll make this Overview of Modern JS Fundamentals. And let's also add something in the body because I'm going to open it in the browser. Let's see if we can see something. So I'm going to create a heading. So again, with emmet, I can just write h1 and then dot heading. This will give me a class. And if I then press enter, it will already create the complete HTML element for me, right? So this emmet helps us out with HTML and also CSS. This is a quick overview of modern JS. All right, so this is just a very simple HTML document. So now I'm going to open it up in the browser. I can do this by clicking and dragging this here on the top part of my browser here. Let's see if that works. And yeah, it works, right? So remember, this is the first file that the browser will receive. So if you go to a website, this is the first file that it gets back. And then this file in turn can link to other resources like JavaScript or CSS or a font or images, right? But it starts with HTML, right? So let's actually try doing that, right? So this is the first file that the browser receives. So it's going to go line by line, interpreting everything here. And now let's say that we want to link to an external resource, right? So let's say that we need a font for our website or web app, right? So I'm just quickly going to copy it here. And let's see if I can distribute this over multiple lines. Yeah, I can, right? So here we are linking to, well, it's a style sheet, right? But it's a font, right? But fonts, we use style sheets for that, right? So now this HTML page is linking to an external resource. And there could be other ones as well. For example, we could have an image, or more specifically a fav icon, right? So I could link to something else. Let's see. Just distributing this over multiple spaces because we don't have much width here. Right, so now we are linking to another resource. And now we could link also to a font set, right? So the one that we're going to use is font awesome, right? This does not come out of the box. The browser does not know what this is, right? So we need to get it from somewhere, and this is the address where we can get it from, right? So if I save this now, this file, and I go back to our page here, if I reload the page, you can see, well, one of the things we can see is now that we have this icon here. Remember, when you go to a page, this is the first file that we get back. It's going to go line by line. It's going to see, oh, we need a font. Oh, we need an icon. It's going to go to this address. It's going to fetch that icon. It can take a couple of seconds, and then it's going to put that icon right there, right? And it has now also fetched. We don't see that here. This font awesome. And we also need to know a little bit about CSS, because one of the things we can do with JavaScript is manipulate the CSS as well. So in the HTML, I can write CSS like this, right? So you can actually just write blah, blah, blah CSS in here. But we want a clean separation between HTML and CSS and JavaScript. So ideally, we could put our CSS in its own file. And that's actually what we're going to do. So I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call it style.css. Why style? Well, you could see that's an abbreviation for style sheet. You know, other common names are styles or main.css. As long as the extension is CSS, the browser will understand how to interpret it, right? And then I could write CSS in here, right? So let's say I want to style this H1. I need to select it in CSS, right? Now in CSS, you can select by tag name, right? But that's generally speaking, it's a bad practice. People tend to use class names for that. So that's why I've given this a class. To select by class, you have to use the dot, right? So dot heading. You can also select by ID, by the way, and then you have to use the hashtag, right? But these CSS selectors, we're actually going to use them in JavaScript as well, as we'll see, right? So now I want to style this. Let's say I want to give this a font size of 15 pixels. Right, you can write the CSS declarations in the curly braces. If I now refresh, nothing changes actually, right? And why is that? Because when I load the page and the browser, is going to go through this file line by line, right? It's going to go line by line, but where are we linking to our style sheet? We are not linking to it. So the browser does not know it exists, right? So remember, really, it's really important to understand this is the first file that the browser receives, right? So we really have to make sure that whatever we need is in here. Otherwise, the browser will simply not know of its existence. So I can write link and it will give me this complete link tag here. It asks me for the path to this style sheet. Now in HTML, you can just write style.css because it's in the same folder here. You can also write /. This is actually the more common format in JavaScript files. But in HTML, we also write it like this, right? So now the browser will know of its existence. It will get the style sheet and it will apply it to the page. Because now when I load the page, you can see it has become much smaller, right? 15 pixels. All right, so now we get to our JavaScript, right? So JavaScript is also an external resource, right? So it's just one of the other resources. We have style sheets, we have fonts, we have icons. JavaScript is also an external resource. Now these days, the web apps, the websites that we create are very JavaScript heavy, right? So it's actually, a big external resource, you could say. And this is also where as developers these days we spend most of our time. But how do we actually include the JavaScript in our HTML? So just like with CSS, we can actually just write it. We can write it in our HTML because we also have script tags, right? So I could write my JavaScript in here, but for the same reason, like we want some separation, right? We want separation between HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So we ideally also put this in its own file or files, as we'll see, right? But let's start off with one file. So I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call it script.js, also a common name, but other people may call it app.js. Or if you have many JavaScript files, you can give them more specific names, right? As long as the extension is JS, the browser will understand what to do with it. Now we can write JavaScript in here, but just like with CSS, we have to link to it, right? And now with JavaScript, it's a little bit strange. We don't have link. We still use script actually. And then we use source, right? So then the path to this script file is, well, it's in the same folder, so we can write script.js. Now in JavaScript files, if we link to other things in the JavaScript files, we also use // right? So maybe you're more familiar with that. But in HTML, we're still in an HTML file, we write it more commonly like this. Okay, now what's the problem with this? Because this is actually not how people do it, and this is also not how people have done it in the past. Right, so as soon as the browser receives this file, it's going to go line by line and it's going to see, oh, we need to get this style sheet. So it's going to make another network request to get this style sheet, right? And then it sees, oh, we need an icon. It's going to make another network request to get that icon, right? The same goes for these style sheets. Now, when it starts fetching these style sheets, these will be fetched in parallel, but the rest of the page will not be blocked, right? So the rest of the page can continue building, you could say. Now, when we get to our script here, that is not the case. So as soon as the browser sees this script here, it will actually stop building the page, right? So this is, you could say, blocking, right? So this is blocking the building of the rest of our page, right? And there are certain technical reasons for this. One of the reasons for this is simply that JavaScript can manipulate the HTML, right? So the browser will not know what this script is going to do. To be safe, it will actually start fetching the script. It will wait until the script gets back and it will execute the script. And only then will it continue building the rest of the page, right? So it's blocking right now. And to solve this problem in the past, what people did is put it at the end of the HTML file, right? So at the end of the body element, right? So now the entire page will be built and then only at the end do we get to the script. Now the downside of this is that it takes a long time basically before the browser can make that network request to fetch the script, right? Because it's only at the end that it becomes aware of it, you could say, right? So this is not an optimal solution either, because it takes a long time before the browser can make that network request, and ideally it starts fetching all of the external resources as quickly as possible, right? Because we need speed. These are modern web apps, modern websites. We want speed, we want snappiness. So we want things to be as quick, as fast as possible, right? So we have a modern solution to this problem, and it's simply to put it back right here. The problem with this is that it's blocking, but now we have an attribute that we can add called defer. And defer will make sure that it does not block the rest of the page, but it can still fetch the script file, right? So now it will make a network request to get that script file while not blocking the page, right? So this is the optimal solution, right? So that's how we can include JavaScript in our websites and web apps, right? So that's how websites and web apps work. Starts off with HTML. The HTML in turn links to other resources, and the browser will make a network requests to get all of these other resources, right? So to completely load a website or web app, if I go to a big web app or website like Airbnb.com, I wouldn't be surprised if it has dozens of other resources, right? So it would need to fetch dozens of other resources, make dozens of requests in order to completely put together the page. All right, now let's talk more about JavaScript. That's what we're here for. Now we can write JavaScript and we can be assured that it's included in the HTML. I'm going to put the HTML here. All right, now in the JavaScript, there are a couple of things that I want to show you. So let me actually just copy the things I want to show you. Okay, I'm going to close the sidebar here. Okay, so there are 6 things that I think are really important to understand. So let me start off with the first one here, and let me actually add some spaces here. All right, so well, you can already see we can write comments in JavaScript files with 2 forward slashes, right? And then that's how you write a comment, right? That's the first thing that's obvious here. All right, now in JavaScript, we have variables, and we also have so-called data types and structures, right? These are really important to understand. So let's say that we're creating a web app or website for homeowners, right? So you are a homeowner and you need a new floor, or you need a new bathroom, or your kitchen needs an update, right? So you go to the website that we're gonna create here, and there are contractors who will bid on your job, right? So you need a new kitchen, you go to our platform, you need a company that's gonna update the kitchen, right? You're not gonna do it yourself, you're gonna hire someone to do that, and we are the platform that will facilitate that. This is actually a very common business model for that you could work on as a developer, these platform type of companies, right? Now you can imagine in a platform like that, the homeowner needs to give a description of the job that needs to be done, right? So we need to have some text. And in JavaScript, if we have text, we call it a string. We use quotation marks. So the string could be something like, we need a new floor. Right? You can use singular or double quotation marks. I use singular because it's easier, it's faster to write for me, right? So I have a string saying we need a new floor now. But this is just some loose code here. We cannot write it like this, right? So we want to store this somewhere. And to store this somewhere, we use variables, right? So traditionally, people use the var keyword to create a new variable. So you use var and then the name of the variable, but let's call it description, right? So I have created a new variable now called description, and I want to put the string in there, right? I want to assign the string to this variable, right? We use the equal sign to assign that, and then the value that you want to assign to that, right? So I have a value, a string, assigning to a variable called description, right? And then I'm going to use a semicolon at the end, right? So in JavaScript, after every statement, and we'll talk about what a statement is, we use a semicolon, right? We'll talk more about that later. It's not really important for now, right? Now, I could also have a number type, right? So maybe we also need some kind of price or square meters, anything that has to do with numbers. You can imagine that square meters is important for a new floor, right? So I could create a new variable and maybe the square meters is 100, right? So I'm storing the value 100 in a new variable called square meters. This is a different type. You can see it has no quotation marks. This is a number type, right? Now in JavaScript, if you have 2 words, you write the first word in lower case and the second word in uppercase. In other programming languages, you may see something like this. This is snake case, right, with the underscore, or kebab case, with a hyphen, right? In JavaScript, we use camel case. All right, so here we are using the var keyword, but this is not the way to do it in modern JavaScript. In modern JavaScript, we have actually two new ones called let and const. And we're going to use this right from the bat in project 1 because I want to teach you modern JavaScript. I want to teach you the right habits right from the start, right? So I'm not going to teach you the bad habits first and then improve on that. No, we're going to start with the right habits right from the bat. We have two new ones, right? So instead of var, we can also write let or const. Both will work here. So when should you use let and when should you use const? So what's wrong with var, by the way? Why can't we just continue using var, right? So if I have some variable, maybe just some silly example here, 5, I'm assigning 5 to a variable called test. So the problem with this is I could accidentally write something like this, right? If it's a big project, you know, or multiple people who work on it, and this will actually work. So now the test variable actually has the value of 10. And this is, you know, this is a problem because, well, we don't want to accidentally override our variables. And this is common because, and this is quite common because for some things, you know, there's only like one name that you really come up with, right? So naming things in programming is actually quite tricky. This is actually, you know, a significant problem, how silly it may seem. For a lot of things in your code, like everyone will basically come up with the same name. Sometimes it means you start accidentally override your previous variables. Now there are more problems with the var keyword. So let and const solve these issues. So for example, if I have a new variable const, right? If I try to do the following, this will actually give us an error, right? And actually also in our script file, right? So the code editor is helping us out here. It's telling us we cannot do this. Right, so const, you know, this is a constant, right? We cannot reassign this. We can also not do this, right? I cannot reassign a new value to this constant. Now I can do that with let though, right? So I could override the let value here, right? So with let, we can override that value, and sometimes we need to do that. Right, so sometimes and we'll see an example of that. But generally speaking, with const, we do not have that issue. So const is more strict. And generally speaking, you want to be more strict with yourself. You want to force yourself to be precise so that you reduce the number of bugs and, you know, the number of unintended things in your code. Right? So generally speaking, what people do these days in the JavaScript world is they use const for everything. So they use const as the default, unless you cannot use const, because for example, maybe you actually do need to assign a new value to the variable. In that case, use let, right? And that's also what I do. That's also what we're going to do in this course. So we're going to use const for everything, unless we cannot use const. In that case, we'll use let, right? There are more subtle differences between let and const and var, and I'll show you some of them. This is enough for now, right? So we have strings, we have numbers. We could also have booleans. So maybe, does the floor need special coating? Well, this can be true or false, right? No quotation marks. It's actually text without the quotation marks, but you can only say true or false. That's a boolean. All right, now you can also need some kind of list. And in JavaScript, if you need a list, we use an array for that. So you can imagine in our platform here, maybe at some point we need options for the floor, right? So this is going to be a list. We use an array for a list. So you use square brackets, and then in these square brackets, we can add all the options. So for example, carpet, right? This is a string. And maybe hardwood is an option. Or tiles, right? So this array has 3 elements now, right? So whatever's in the array, we call it an element, and these happen to be strings. I could also add numbers here, like 99, right? Or booleans, like true, false, and also arrays and objects in here, right? So I could actually create a new array in the array, right? With another string, right? And I could even add objects, right? So, but we haven't discussed objects yet, right? So my point being is you can add anything you want in these lists. But for this use case, this makes sense, right? So we could have 3 options, let's say. All right, so that is an array. Now here we have all of these things separate, right? So we just have some loose code here and they happen to be right below each other, but you know, there's not really anything connecting description to square meters here, right? So this is all separate. If we want to associate them together to represent something bigger, for example, a renovation job, we can use curly braces here. This will be an object. Right, so objects in JavaScript, you'll see these all the time. And we use an object to represent some kind of entity in your code, right? So one of the entities in our platform could be a renovation job. And this can consist of properties. So for example, maybe there is a renovation job, right? And the owner name is John, right? So the homeowner's name is John. And this renovation job has a maximum price of, let's say, 5,000. Right, so you write it like this. This is the property, right? It has a property name called owner name and a property value, which is a string John. And then you put a comma for the next property, right? And it can be a string, it can be a number, it can be anything you want, right? So category, maybe in the bathroom category, right? Maybe John, the homeowner John has submitted a job looking for contractors to update his bathroom, right? Maybe it needs a new shower, right? So we can add new shower, true or false, right? True, right? So you can see we have a string here, we have numbers, we have booleans, and it can also have an array in here actually. So color options, well, maybe that's an array, right? So I can have something like sea green. I don't know what the popular colors are, right? Or maybe ocean blue, right? Or cyan, right? So we can have an array in here, right? So it looks a little bit complicated, but it's just a list of color options. And let's see, I can also have a function in here actually, and we'll talk about what functions are. But just to give you a quick example, maybe you know it has some kind of function, calculate price, right? And we'll talk about the syntax for a function. This is going to look a little bit strange, but it could have a function in here, right? So this is just an example. I will remove this, right? So the arrays, you can nest all of that in here. Let's keep it a little bit simple here, right? And also we have one information about the owner, but maybe we want more information about the owner. So we could actually make this an object as well. So the name would be John. He would have an address. Some street 55, maybe a city, right? Some city, right? So here we are associating these properties together for the owner object, which happens to be one of the properties in the renovation object, right? So you can make this as complicated as you want. I just quickly want to show you what people do in practice sometimes. Right, but we have objects to represent some kind of entity, because here we just have some loose code. We have a description and square meters. They are not connected right now, right? They're not connected in any way, right? But owner name and maximum price, they are connected here because they both belong to this renovation job object. So clearly they have to do something with each other. Right, now one of the benefits of this is, for example, let's say I want to submit this data to a server, for example. We'll talk about how to do that and what a server is. But let's say I want to save it in a database. I need to pass this to a server or a database. Right? And right now, you know, if we just have some loose code, we would have to write out all of these individual pieces of data. Right, this is just some pseudocode. This is not actually how you would do it, but it's going to be something like this, because we would have to write out all of these pieces of data individually, right? Because they are not connected. But if we put them in one object, right? If we just have an object, we only have to pass the name of the object, renovation job, right? And then someone can look inside the object to see the individual properties. Right, the individual pieces of data, right? So this makes for a much more efficient way of passing data. Another very common example is an error object, right? So in our program, we can run into errors, right? And this error usually consists of individual pieces of data, right? For example, an error could have a status code, right? Maybe 404, right? It could have a description, right, of something that went wrong. And maybe it's telling us, should we retry it, right? Maybe retry. False, don't retry it, right? Maybe we need to fix something first, right? So now we have associated these properties together to represent an error, right? It also makes it easier for us to reason about our code because we have entities to hold in our head, right? So objects are very important and they look a little bit strange, but we'll practice with them a lot, right? So let's actually see how we can access that information, right? So let's start with the array actually. So let's say I want to see what's in the array. Right, so now we have declared all of these variables, right? We have created them. We have not used them yet. So what if I want to use this? What if I want to get all of the floor options? I want to output that somewhere. If you want to output something on the page, what we can use, let me actually make this bigger, right? So what people use is right-click, inspect. You may already be familiar with this. Now, when you do that first, you're gonna see here in the Elements tab, you're gonna see an overview of the HTML. Right, so here we have these HTML elements. Right, so if I click on this H1, you can see on the page where it is, but also below here, it's going to show the styles, the CSS for this H1 element. And I have a course on CSS. I highly recommend you go through that if you want to work with the front end, because CSS is crucial. And if you're not comfortable with CSS, you're going to spend a lot of time and energy being frustrated. So check that out if you're interested in CSS. But you can see the styles for this element in here. Now, in this tab, console, this is relevant for JavaScript. So in this console, we can write JavaScript actually, right? So I could actually create a variable here, right? It's gonna give undefined, it's not important here, but I can actually write JavaScript here, and I can also output JavaScript here, which is actually very helpful because as we'll see, you're gonna run into issues in your code. And it's very helpful if you can output the value of a variable to see if it's what you would expect it to be. And I can also dock this on the bottom, by the way. So I have it on the side right now, but I'm putting it next to my code editor. So I'm going to dock it on the bottom. All right, so now I want to output. I want to use this console here to see the floor options, or maybe just one of the options. So we use console.log for that, right? We're logging something to the console. We can do other things with this console. There's also error. We can also do other things. It's actually, if you press dot here, it will give you all of the things we can do with that. The most common option here, if we log on, is log. Right, so we use dot notation, we'll talk about that. And then we use opening and closing parentheses because it's actually a so-called function. We are calling a function with inputs, right? So now we're going to give this function an input. For example, I can give it an input of 5. I'm gonna put a semicolon at the end. Again, we'll talk about semicolons. Seems a little bit silly, but you know, it comes up every now and then. So I'll have a video on that eventually. So I am calling a function called log. We'll talk about functions. I'm giving it an input of 5. If I now save this and reload the page, you can see in the console now, we see the 5, right? Now I don't want to see 5, I want to see a floor option. So now I'm going to say floor options. What if we just do this, floor options? I'm going to save that. And it actually shows me the array. I can open it up and you can see here, it actually shows 0, 1, and 2. It also shows the length, right? And then it shows a very weird prototype with 2 square brackets, right? This looks very intimidating. And this is not relevant for now. But what is relevant is that we can see these indexes, right? These are indexed. So if we want to access the first element of the array, we actually, right, we can do this we can access individual elements with square brackets. And if we want the first one, it's actually not 1. Because the indexes of an array start at 0. So if I want the first one, right, we have to give it the index of the array that we want to access. If I use this, if now reload the page, I get carpet, right? So I can access individual elements in the array like this. Now I'm accessing the element in the array with an index of 1, which is not carpet, right? You would think, oh, it's carpet because that's the first one. No, it's actually hardwood. Because it starts from 0, 0, 1, 2. So if I give 2, it should give us tiles, right? Right, so but that's how we can access individual elements of the array. Now, what about objects? Right, and by the way, if I want to access the description, I can just write description here. Right, this is just a string. Right, it will give us the string. Right, if I want to access the square meters, right, I can just write out the variable name. Right, but with arrays and objects, it's a little bit trickier because we have multiple things in there. So with an object, we don't use. With an object, we use dot notation. So I can say renovation job. Actually, let's just log the entire object. Let's see what we get. So here we actually get the entire object. I can also open it up, and it shows us category, right? We know this, and it shows us this weird prototype thing again. This is not important for now, right? But let's say I don't want the entire object. I only want to know the maximum price. If I now reload, it gives us 5,000. Right, so if I want to get any of these individual pieces of data, I have to use the key in this key value pair. Right, so if I want to know the owner name of this renovation job, it's John. Right, I use dot owner name. Does this renovation job need a new shower? I can output it like this, true. Right, these are just some very quick, maybe silly examples of variables and data types and structures. Let's move on to functions. Very important. All right, so with functions, we actually also have some innovation in the JavaScript language. So the traditional way of writing functions, and you will still see this very often, by the way. And also, this is not necessarily wrong, right? So with traditional functions, there's nothing necessarily wrong with doing it this way. Let me actually just show you what the differences are. So let's say we want to do something, right? So whenever you want to do something, you may want to use a function. So you use the function keyword, and then you give it a name. This is all, again, this is all traditional. And after the name, we have opening and closing parentheses. And then we have opening and closing curly braces. And actually, there should not be a semicolon here. So in this function, we can group statements actually, right? So here, you know, we have statement after statement. These are statements, right? So a script file is basically just a sequence of statements, right? That's any program is a sequence of statements. So first, this statement is completed, and the statement, what does the statement do here? Well, we're only assigning a string to a new constant called description, and then we're assigning 100 to square meters here, right? So now I want to write some statements in the function body here, and then we can invoke that whenever we want. So for example, we could have a new variable here. I call this a variable, by the way, even though we create a variable with the const keyword, I'm still going to refer to this as a variable because it belongs to the category variables together with var and let, right? And people refer to this as variables still. I'm creating a new variable called price, but it's created with the const keyword. The price could be something like this. We can write mathematical expressions, right? That's no problem. It works as expected. Let's say that the price is 1,000 plus 3,000, right? Which is not realistic, but let's go with the example here. So what will happen here is if we invoke the function, this statement will be run. And in the statement, we are calculating 1,000 plus 3,000. And the result of this is 4,000. The result of that will be assigned to the variable price, right? And let's say that we want to log that to the console, right? So this is actually going to be the second statement, right? So we have two statements in this function body. And if I save this and reload the page, you can see nothing happens because we have only created the function here. We have only specified what it should do, right? But we have not invoked the function yet. We should call the function if we want to run the statements inside its body, right? Now the statements here, by the way, as soon as the file has been downloaded and the page has been built, these statements will be run. From top to bottom, it will run these statements, right? But the statements in the function body here will not be run immediately. It will only run when we actually call the function, right? So let's say later on, I'm just going to put it right here. we want to invoke the function and run those statements as well, right? So we call the function with the name and then the opening and closing parentheses. And what will happen is the browser will go line by line here, right? Running all of these statements here. Eventually it gets to this function here, right? And it knows, okay, so we need to create a new function called calculate price, and the function body contains these two statements, but it will not run these, right? It will just specify it basically. And then when it gets to this line here, right, only when it gets to this line where it reads the name of the function and these opening and closing parentheses, it will know, okay, so now we need to go to this function and we need to run these statements in the function body, right? So we can group statements together in a function body, and then we can run those statements whenever we want, right? That's how functions work. And functions are usually quite tricky to understand, especially when you're new to programming. So don't worry, if anything of this is not clear to you, don't worry about that. We're going to practice with anything, right? So now when I save and reload, you can see we actually get 4,000 logged to the console. And that's actually the result of this calculation. The result will be stored in price, and then in the second statement here, we're logging that to the console. Right? And we can do other things. We can have other statements. I can log something else. Hello, right? If I do this now, we actually see 2 logs to the console, right? So I can group as many statements as I want in here, and they will not be run immediately, right? They will only be run when I actually invoke the function. The statements here are run immediately when the script is evaluated, right? But here they are only run when I really want them to run, right? That's how I think about it. All right, now with functions, quite often we want to give it an input, right? So maybe I want to call this function with an input of 5,000 or 10,000 or some other number. We want to change the definition of the function, right? So we want to change the specification of the function a little bit to now also incorporate inputs. And we can do that in these opening and closing parentheses here in the function definition, right? So let's say this price here depends on how many square meters there are, right? So the price will not be 1,000 plus 3,000, it will be 1,000 plus the square meters, right? This is more realistic. The more square meters there are, the higher the price. And don't worry if you're not mathematically comfortable or if you're good at math, because these days mathematics is not a very important aspect of front end or even, I would say, back end development. The only thing we are doing here though is, we're adding square meters, whatever that may be, right? So now I'm going to call the function, but we know it's expecting an input, right? So now let's say I'm giving it an input of 5,000. And what will happen is the browser will assign 5,000 to square meters, right? So then in the first statement here, it will be 1,000 plus 5,000, right? And then let's actually log this to see what happens. I'm logging whatever the result of that is. Well, I'm actually logging the variable price. The result will be stored in price, right? So now if I reload, you can see we get 6,000, right? But maybe the input is 10,000. Right, so now 10,000 will be assigned to square meters. Right now we get 11,000. Right, so that's how inputs work. All right, so last thing I want to show with this function here is returning something from the function. Because let's say, I don't want to log to the console here. I just want to calculate the price. And then what? Right, what if we just do this? Like, is this helpful? Like, why would we ever do this in our program? Because now if I just reload the page, okay, so we have calculated the price and then what? Nothing happens, right? We have only calculated it. The result is stored in a variable price. And then what? It just gets lost in the ether, you could say, right? So this is not really helpful to us. So usually you want to continue with some result of this function. We want to return that. So I want to return the price. So now when you call the function here, we get something back, right? So when I call this function with, let's say 5,000, this will actually give us the price back. And we can store that in a new variable, maybe called result, right? So what happens here is we call the function, right? With the input of 5,000, 5,000 will be assigned to square meters, and then it will run the statements in the function body, right? The body is within the square braces, so it will run 1,000 plus 5,000, 6,000. We'll assign it to price, and then statement 2 is return price. So what that means is that you could think of it like this. This actually gets replaced with 6,000 because we are returning something. So this is like, that's how you can think of it. It will give us 6,000 back. That's going to be assigned to result, right? And then, well, let's say that we want to log result. Okay, let's see. Okay, so now we get 6,000, right? So functions are just a way of grouping together statements. They can receive inputs and you can return something from them. All right, so don't worry if it's not completely clear to you, especially if you're new to programming. It's going to be a little bit intimidating with functions, I think. Also because you haven't seen many examples yet of why we even use this. All right, now traditionally people also write functions a little bit differently. This is also something you will see quite often. So instead of starting off with the function keyword and then giving the function a name, people also do it like this with a variable. So now we're going to have a function that's still going to have an input, right? But we don't have the function name after the function keyword. And now I actually do use a semicolon, right? And we can still have this, right? The function body stays the same. Right, so now what we're doing here is I'm creating a new function. What I have selected now is a function, but it's an anonymous function actually, right? It has no name. Right here, we had a name after the function keyword. Here it has no name, but I'm assigning this function to a variable called calculate price. Right, so the browser can still derive a name from this. So it works the same. So I can still use calculate price with an input of 5,000. Let's say, you know, I can, right? So we get the price back, right? Let me actually comment this out because now we have two functions with the same name, right? So this will still give us a function with the same name. The browser will simply derive it from it like that because we are assigning the function to a variable called calculate price, right? And we can use it in the same way, right? So calculate price with 5,000 will give us 6,000. It will return 6,000. And I could assign that to a constant called result again, right? And then I could log the result. We can also do it immediately, by the way. So I can also simply do this, right? We don't have to assign the return value to a new variable first. We can also just do it like this, because if we do this, and this will return the price. So it's the same. It's the same as simply writing 6,000. This is what we get back. Right, so if I reload the page, we get 6,000, right? If I call it with 10,000, it should become 11,000, right? So it's the same as just writing this, right? Because the function, like the function will return 11,000, right? So this is an alternative way of writing traditional functions. This is something that you'll see quite often as well. All right, so now let's talk about the modern way of writing functions. So these are called arrow functions. And of course, I'm going to use const here. And we actually use that alternative way with arrow functions. So instead of var, we're going to use const, right? So far, so good. All right, so now with arrow functions, one of the benefits is it's much more compact. And really, if you come from the traditional way, it will look a little bit strange at first, but once you get used to it, you'll never go back because arrow functions are much faster to write. They also look more elegant. Overall, it's a much better way of using functions. I have to give credit to whoever came up with this because it's actually very, it's actually one of the bigger benefits of using modern JavaScript, in my opinion. So instead of writing the function keyword, we don't have to do that anymore. We will still have an input. So we still write square meters, right? But without the function keyword, right? So we don't have to write function, the entire time. All right, now how does the browser know that it is a function though? Well, we use a fat arrow. So we have equal sign and then this rightward pointer, right? So that's new, but then we still have curly braces, right? For the function body. And I will still use a semicolon here at the end. And actually the function body will be the same. The logic of the function or in the function is still the same, right? It's just a different way of specifying it, right? So if we compare now, this is the modern way of writing functions. The only thing that has changed actually here is, well, we use const, but that's separate from functions. We don't have to write the function keyword anymore. Instead of that, we have a fat arrow. Now the syntax will look a little bit strange because I think it's because we have an equal sign here and then we also have an equal sign here. And I think it throws off people a little bit, but you have to see it like this. This is the function, right? And we're assigning it to a variable called calculate price. And we did the exact same here. This is the function, right? It has no name, but we're assigning it to a variable called calculate price, right? Arrow functions also do not have names, but because we assign it to a variable, we can still use it like this, right? So we can still invoke it by the variable name, right? So let's see if this works. If this still works, if I reload, it still works. All right, so this is the arrow function syntax. This is the modern way of doing it. And this is also what we're going to use. Actually, let me comment this out as well, because we should focus on this. Now, with arrow functions, we can take it even further than this. So you may think, well, is this really that much of an improvement? We have only removed function and we've added this. So is this really that much better? So we can take it even further. Okay, and you may get confused by this. Don't worry, we're going to practice with this a lot. So what I can also do with arrow functions, actually, I'm just going to copy this and I'll leave this here for comparison. So we have the arrow function here. So how can we make this even more compact? So what we can do is we can even, if you have one input, we can even remove the parentheses. Okay, so it seems a little bit silly, like, okay, now we can remove the parentheses. Is this really that much of an improvement? Well, this is already, you know, if you compare it with the previous, the traditional function, this is already quite a bit of a difference. Okay, but we can take it even further. And this is especially useful for short functions. So we actually have a pretty short function here. We only do one little thing, you know, and we actually have 2 lines here, but it could also be 1 line, right? So what we are doing is we're calculating this, we're assigning it to a new variable, and then in the second line, we're returning that variable. But we don't actually need to do this, by the way. But this has nothing to do with arrow functions. We can also simply return it immediately like this. We don't have to create a whole new variable for that. And then, you know, we can also just do it in 1 line. And this has nothing to do with arrow functions. So let me actually just also do it for all the other ones so we don't get confused. Right, so we can do this in any function. You know, you don't have to create a whole separate variable and then return that variable. Like if you have one little, you know, thing that you have to calculate, you can do it in 1 line like this, right? That goes for every function. But the thing in arrow functions is, if you have a short little function like this, we can remove even more stuff. So we can even remove the curly braces here. And we can put this return here on the same line. Right? And we can now even remove the return keyword. Right? So now this is the final, like this is the most compact form of the arrow function. And this is very useful in many instances in JavaScript these days, right? So again, don't worry if you feel uncomfortable with the syntax here, but you can see that this is a big difference compared to the traditional functions, right? So especially if you have like a 1-line code in your function, this is a godsend because this is very quick to write. And once you get used to the syntax, you'll never go back, right? So what happened, this is the function, right? This is actually a function. What I've selected now is a function. It has no name, but it has an input. And since this is on the same line, the browser will know that we intend to return this, right? So we don't have to explicitly write return, it's implicit. But because it's on the same line, it will return this. So this is the function, and we're assigning that function to a variable called calculate price, right? So now if we try this again, it still works. If I call it with 3000, we get this back, right? So this is the evolution of functions in JavaScript, and we will practice with this a lot. All right, now one last thing about functions is about their names. So the function names, right? So I said that these are anonymous functions, right? These are anonymous functions, right? But we're assigning it to a variable. So that's how they get their name, basically. Now, about these names for functions, usually you want to make them start with a so-called verb. So a verb in English is what we have calculate, right? Or make, destroy, or drive. You can imagine it starts off with doing something. That's usually how functions are named. All right, now I have 4 other things, but these are going to be much quicker. So don't worry, we're going to be finished soon. So a very common thing we want to do in modern JavaScript apps or websites is we want to create a string with variables. So for example, let's say we have a price. The price is 9,000, right? And now I want to create a string. I'm going to call it result, right? So a string is with quotation marks. You can imagine that we could have a string like this. The total cost will be, and then I want to use the price here. The price could be 2,000, could be 20, it could be 12,000. Whatever the price is, I want to put that here in the string. The cost will be price. That's what I want. But how do we do that? How can I output the value of that price here? Can we just write price? Because here in this instance, it should be the total cost will be 9,000. That's what I would want in this instance. If the price was 5,000, it should be 5,000, right? Can we do this? Will this work? If I log this to the console and reload, that will not work. We actually get price, the text, right? Literally price. So traditionally, to solve this, we can concatenate strings. This is string concatenation. So we can do it like this, but what we can do is we can use the plus sign here and then use price, right? The plus sign here is not a calculation, by the way. So here, if you have 2 numbers, right, because square meters will be a number, right? So you have 2 numbers, and with the plus sign, it's a mathematical expression. Here, if you have a string and a number, it will actually make the total a string, right? So it's not a mathematical calculation. It will understand this as adding this variable to this string, right? So if I try this will work, right? So this is string concatenation, and it's against the colon here. So I'm going to add a space here, right? So this will work, and this is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with this, but there we have a modern way of doing this, which has other benefits, right? So I'm going to comment this out. And now the modern way of doing something like this is with template literals. And you use backticks for this, so not quotation marks, but backticks. And here we have the total cost will be, right? And now we want to get that price, right? Now this will still not work, right? But now I can, it looks a little bit strange, but I can use $sign and opening and closing curly braces. So the total cost will be price, right? So if I try this, it will still work, right? So if I change the price to 5,000, it works, right? So this syntax is especially helpful if you have multiple lines, because I can simply press enter here and I can add as many lines as I want, but it will still work, right? With the previous syntax, if you had multiple lines, this would be a major hassle, right? So this is especially useful for multiple lines, right? I also like it for, you know, a short 1-line string like this, right? That was just a quick example of string concatenation and template literals. This is a template literal. All right, so then we get to if else, because if else has also received some innovation. So let's say, again, let's start with the price. I have a price of 5,000. And now I want to do something depending on the value of the price. So usually you want to use the if else construct in JavaScript for that. So we can say if something is true, if the price is more, right? I can run it like this. If the price is more than 2,000, then I want to do something. And then I use the opening curly braces. And else, right? So if that is not true, I want to do something else. So if it is true, if the price is more than 2,000, I want to log hello to the console. Otherwise, right, if that is not true, I want to log blah blah to the console, right? So if you use if else, whatever is in the parentheses here, if this evaluates to true, we go in the first block here, the block being whatever's in the curly braces here. If this evaluates to false, we go into the else block, right? It works as expected actually. So this makes sense intuitively, right? So here the price is 5,000. So 5,000 is greater than 2,000. Well, that will evaluate to true. So if I refresh here, you can see we get hello, right? Because we go into this block. We can also use less than, right? So if the price is less than 10,000, 5,000 is less than 10,000 is what we write here. Well, that is true. That will evaluate to true. So we still see hello. If I use 1,000, what we are saying here is if 5,000 is less than 1,000, well, that will actually evaluate to false. So we go into the else block. So now we should see blah blah, right? So this works as expected. Okay, now we can also check if it's equal to something specific. So we can say if the price is 5,000, right? We use double equal sign here because we use one equal sign for assignment, right? We're assigning something, but to check whether something is actually equal to something, we use two equal signs. If the price is 5,000 is what we're saying here. Well, price is 5,000. So that's true. That will evaluate to true, right? If it's 4,000, we're saying 5,000 is equal to 4,000. Well, that's false, right? So we get blah, blah, right? So this also works as expected. All right, now the tricky thing here is that in our project, we can also have a string of 5,000, right? So imagine that we have a string, right? We could have a string like this. The floor, you know, has an area of about 5,000 square meters. You can imagine that we have a string like this, maybe a description of the job that needs to be done. The homeowner, you know, could write something like this, right? So you can imagine that we can have 5,000 as a string type, not a number type, but as a string type. So now what happens here? If the price, right? So now we will have a string here. So we are comparing a string with a number type. So what happens in this case? If I reload, you can see we get hello. So clearly it evaluates this to true, right? So even though this is a string type, this is a number type. We call this, you could say this is a loose comparison because it does not really take into account the type, right? Now let's say that we want to be strict with ourselves, which is usually the best practice. You know, whenever you have the option between loose or strict, try to be strict. If we want to take the type into account as well, we can have triple equal, right? So now when we try this, we get blah blah. So clearly it evaluates this to false because it will see, oh, price here is a string type and this is a number type. And this is a strict equality operator. So we should also take the type into account. And since these types are different, well, that's not equal, right? These are different, so it's false. It will evaluate to false, right? So we will try to use the triple equal, the stricter equality operator to do these if-else statements, right? So that's quickly what I want to show you. Now, what's the innovation here? Right, let's say, again, we have something like this, 3,000. So I have 5,000 is more than 3,000, right? So this is actually a lot of typing. There's a more compact way of writing this these days. So what we can also say, I'm going to comment this out. Nothing wrong with this. Again, this is just a traditional way of doing it. If it's much bigger than this, like if you have more lines of code, then usually you do still want to use the if else, right? But if you have a short check, right? This is a very simple if else. You may opt for the ternary operator. So we can say if the price is more than 3,000, right? Which is the same as here. If this is true, we have a question mark here. If this is true, log hello to the console. Otherwise, colon, log blah blah, right? Semicolon at the end, right? So this is the same here. It will work the same. So if I reload now, we get hello, right? So here we have the condition basically. If this is true, do this. Otherwise, do this. This is much more compact and quicker to write. And that's how this works. And we'll use this. And sometimes we have to use this. And we'll look at why that's the case. All right. Oh, actually, one more thing I want to show you here very quickly. Actually, let me do it with the old school if else. Sometimes what people will do is simply do this. Right? So if price log hello, otherwise blah blah. Then this looks a little bit strange because we have this is just a number. So if 5,000, like what does this mean? Let's actually see what we get. So if I reload the page, we get hello. So for some reason, it evaluates price here to true. And that's because we also have the concept of truthy and falsy values. So if the price was 0, if we try this, we actually get blah blah. So it evaluates 0 to false, and it evaluates a different number like 5,000 to true. So this is the concept of truthy and falsy values. So the number 5,000 is not explicitly true or false, but it is kind of true, right? It's truthy. In case we force the browser here basically to evaluate it either to true or false, the browser will say, okay, 5,000, well, it's kind of true. It's not really false. It's more in the direction of true, right? It's truthy. And so it will still say, okay, it's true. But 0, right? 0, well, if you force the browser to categorize that as either true or false, it will say, well, 0, well, that's nothing, right? 0 is like empty, it's nothing. It's kind of false. It's not actually literally false, but it's falsy, right? So it will evaluate 0 to false. All right, so now that we know about this, I quickly want to go back to var and let, because maybe you were wondering what's the difference between var and let, because we can change var, but we can also change let, right? So very quickly, I'm just gonna give a quick example here with if else. So the if else here is not important. What's important is that we're writing a variable. We're creating it in this block. So I can say let hello is 5, let hi is 10, right? So I'm using the let keyword here to create a new variable. And now let's say I want to access that variable outside the if else blocks here. So if I try to log hello to the console here, we will actually get an error saying hello is not defined. So what this means is that with let, the let keyword is always scoped to the block. This hello variable here is created in this block. So I can only access it in this block, right? It's scoped to that block. If I now refresh, you can see it works, right? So I can only access hello in here, and I can only access hi in this block, right? With var, if we make this var, and I try to access this hello outside the block now, if I reload here, you can see I can do this with var, right? So var is not scoped to the block, right? But with let, it is always scoped to the block. Var, so does var have no scoping at all? Well, no, with var, if you have a function like this, right? If I create a new variable here, var, okay, is 100, like I can only access var in the function body, right? So var is only scoped to the function basically. And let would also be scoped here, by the way, because it's the block, right? With curly braces, whenever you see curly braces, that's a block. So let would also be scoped here, and var as well. But let then is also scoped to every other block that you're gonna have in your code. And var will only be scoped to the function block and not any other block, right? So let is also a little bit easier to use, I think, because anytime you have a block, it's clear that let will be scoped to that. With var, well, it's not every block, it's only the function, right? But with let, I know, okay, so it's whenever there's curly braces, let will be scoped to that. Same goes for const, by the way, right? So const is also always scoped to the nearest block, right? So let and const are more predictable to work with in that way, and also, yeah, that just makes them easier to use, in my opinion. Now we haven't used let here, we haven't used it yet, but we'll see when to use that. All right, now almost finished. We do need to talk about how to manipulate the HTML. Because you could say that's even the most important thing that we can do with JavaScript. That's maybe even the reason it exists. And also manipulating the CSS. So how can we do this? How can we even interact with other things outside our JavaScript? Well, we have actually already seen an example of that, because here in a console, right, we can already interact with that from our JavaScript, right? Because we've used console here. Now, where is this console coming from? Because usually if I just write some, if I just use a word here, hello, right? If I just write hello and I save this and I refresh, we will actually get an error, right? Well, it will say something like hello, it does not exist or it's not defined, right? So how is it then that if I say console, if I do this and I reload, we don't get that error. So apparently this exists. Right, now this is actually coming from the browser, right? So the browser will actually already create this, it's actually an object, and we will talk more about that, but it will actually already create this console object. And remember, objects are used to represent something, right? So we've seen renovation job is an object. It represents a renovation job, right? We can also have an error object, right? And then the error may have a description, a status code, things like that. And we can have an error object, right? It represents an error, right? This represents the console here, right? And with object, remember we use dot notation if we want to access any of its individual properties. These are called properties. An object is an association of properties, right? And we use dot notation. Now the most common one here is log, right? But we can also do dot warn or dot error, right? So my point being is the browser gives us this console object, and because of that we can interact with it from our JavaScript, and we will be able to do things here. Now we want to be able to manipulate the HTML now. Right, so we want to be able to do things here, you could say, right? Here with where we actually have our HTML. So the browser gives us another object, the document object. Right, so this is also an object that the browser gives us, and now we can use this to interact with the HTML. You can also see the HTML as a document, right? And with this object that we get from the browser, we can also use dot notation to use its properties. Now we'll talk more about that, but I want to show you some of the most common things that we want to do in terms of manipulating HTML. Right, now to quickly show you some examples, here in project 2 I have opened up the console. I can say document, give me all images on the page. So if I write documents.images, we actually get back all the images on the page, right? It's a so-called HTML collection, which is not important here, but what's important is that it actually gives me all the images. And even if I hover them, right? If I hover this cover image element, it will even show this on the page where it is, right? The logo, the background pattern, right? So the pattern here is actually an image, right? And also if I want to see all the forms on the page, right? Here I just have one form. But if I hover it, you can see that it gets selected here on the page, right? So we can use document to interact with our page, right? So I was just showing you an example of getting access to all images or all forms. But what's more common is that we want one particular element, right? Usually you don't want to select all elements, right? We usually want to select one particular element and then do something with that one particular element. Or maybe, a couple of elements with a certain class name. All right, so let me show you some of the common ways that people used in the past, because we don't want to get all forms. We don't want to get all images. Let's say that we just want the particular element. We just want an element with a particular ID, let's say. And so what people did in the past, maybe you've seen this before, right? And if you're new to JavaScript, don't worry, you're not going to recognize this, right? But you could get one particular element with get element by ID, and then you would give the ID in here, right? And it will give you that one particular element. Now maybe we want to get, all elements with a particular class name. Also a very common thing in the past to use something like this. Get elements by class name, and then you would give the class in here. It will give you all the elements with that particular class. Now these days, the modern way of selecting elements is with query selector. This is the most common way these days. And it looks a little bit strange, query, but in here, we can use everything, right? So any query will work, right? So you can use by ID, right? So these are CSS selectors, by the way. So we can write CSS selectors, right? So anything that you could use in CSS to select a heading, for example, I could use H1, right? Select by tag. Or if it has an ID, I could use the ID, right? Here we are selecting by class, right? So here it's the same way. I could select by tag, I could select by ID, right? But you do have to use the symbol here, right? So if I want to select by class, I have to use dot here, right? So this is the most common way, and we'll use class selectors here. So we could select with dot heading, right? Same as in the CSS, and it will give us that individual element. Now I want to store that element in a variable, right? So I'm going to create a new variable here. I'm going to call it heading L. I like to append L at the end of the variable name to indicate that there is an HTML element stored in here. And so this is a very common thing to do. Okay, so now we have selected an element. We now have, you could say, we now have a reference to this heading element in HTML. But now we want to do something with that. We want to manipulate it. All right, so let me show you the most common manipulations that we could do. So a very common thing would be to change the content of this element, right? So we have some text in here. This is a quick overview of modern JS. Let's say that should be different. We can say heading L dot text content, because what we get back here is actually an object representing this HTML element, right? An object represents something, and we use dot notation to use its individual properties, right? So we'll talk more about that, but basically this is an object, right? Because we get an object from this, we're storing that, we're assigning that to a variable called heading L, right? And now we're accessing one of its particular properties called text content. With this property, we can set the text content, right? So let's say this will be a string of hello everyone, right? So I'm assigning a string to the property text content. So now if I reload the page, you can see that the text content here changes, right? From our JavaScript, right? So now we have manipulated the HTML from our JavaScript, right? This is a very common thing, text content. Another very common thing is heading L, and then you can use inner HTML. And let me actually show you the difference between the two. So with this text content, let's say I want to wrap the word everyone in a span, because I want the word everyone to have a bigger font size, let's say. Right, so I can even give it a class heading -- big. Right, so I'm trying to create a new span. Right, there should be an HTML element. That's what I would want, right? Right, so now we have one HTML element here, the H1. But I now also want to create a span element around everyone, right? So let's see if this works. So if I save this and reload, well, this will not work. It will actually treat span as literal text, right? So it will actually write out span. And you can see here in our overview elements here, this is not an HTML element right now, span, it's just text. If you want the string to be parsed as HTML, we can use inner HTML. Right, let me actually copy this string. I'm gonna comment this out. So now I'm gonna refresh again. And now you can see a new element in the HTML has been created, right? Because you can see if I hover this, it will actually show it on the page, right? So with text content, it will not parse this as HTML. It will just parse it as regular text. With inner HTML, it will parse the string as HTML. So it will actually create the HTML elements for us if we run it like this. And then of course we can select this, right? So we can select the span and we can do something like font size 55 pixels, right? So we're using BEM here for the class names. Again, if you want to learn about that, check out my CSS course. If I reload here, you can see now everyone has 55 pixels of font size, right? It's overwriting the previous font size. This is actually the behavior that we want with BEM. Okay, so these are two very common things. Another very common thing is, let me actually save here and refresh. Right, to reset again. Now another very common thing is, let's say, because here we are replacing it, right? When we did this, we're replacing this tag, but maybe I don't want to replace it. Maybe I just want to add something after it, for example. Right, so I can also say heading insert adjacent HTML. Right, and then in here it's slightly different, but it's still string, right? So now we actually have to give an input to a function. Right, so let's actually use the same string here. All right, if I do it this way, and now reload, we get an error. Let's see what's going on here. Okay, so here we get an error and it says failed to execute. 2 arguments required. Okay, so we have given it 1 input. This is called an argument. And it needs 2, right? So what we have to do here is actually give another input because I forgot to specify which position you want to insert this HTML. Should it come before the text or after the text, for example? Let's say that we want it to, oh, it actually gives us the options here. Right, so let's say we want to do it before the beginning. Right, so this string should be parsed as HTML and it should be inserted before the beginning. Okay, so now hello everyone comes before the other text, right? So this is also a way of inserting HTML. Here we were replacing it, right? We were replacing the entire string with a different string. Here we are simply adding HTML, right? And we still have the old text as well, right? So these are very common ways of manipulating the text content and the HTML. All right. Also, let's quickly talk about how to manipulate the CSS. So there are 2 ways that we can manipulate the CSS. So the first one is we can still use this heading L that we selected, and then we can use this style property. And this style property will have properties of its own, right? And these will all be CSS properties, right? So in CSS we can set the color, background color. We can do that here as well, right? So I can set the color, I can set the background color. Now background color in CSS you write it like this, but if you have 2 words here, you should actually write it like this in camel case. And, you know, for example, font size, right? So I have to assign it a value. For example, 55 pixels, right? And it will make it 55 pixels. This is not recommended to do it like this because if you start manipulating the CSS like this, you're going to have these CSS values all over the place. Your JavaScript file will be littered with all sorts of CSS values. We don't want that. We want a clean separation. So we should try to contain all of the CSS in the actual CSS file. And then to manipulate it, we'll use the second way mostly. And that's as follows. So we can change its classes, right? So the H1 here has a class of heading. Right, let me actually refresh this again to reset everything. Right, so we can also change its classes. So I can say class list. And I can add a class, I can remove a class. Remove. Here, let's say we try to add a class, and it will be that big modifier class. Right, so if I try this, it still works. Right, so this is the recommended way of changing your CSS from the JavaScript. And so it's gonna add this class, right? And then I can have other properties in here, as many as I want. And I only have to change 1 class. Right? If I had to do that in JavaScript, we would have a lot of statements, you know, for every individual property. Here, I only have to change 1 class, right? So it's a cleaner way of doing it. All right, so that's manipulating the CSS. Last thing I want to discuss here is events and event handlers, right? So let me show you what I mean by that. On this page, you may not see it, but a lot of events happen. If I click here, if I click here, or if I click here, there are events happening, right? Events are firing. In particular, if I click on this, there's actually a click event. And when I move out of here with my mouse, right? So I'm over here, over this element now with my mouse. If I move out of here, there's actually a mouse leave event. If I enter here with my mouse, there's a mouse enter event. Even if I move my mouse, I have a mouse move event. If I type something with my key on my keyboard, that's also an event. If I'm scrolling the page, that's an event. There are many events, thousands of events that happen on a page when a user interacts with it. And with the vast majority of events, we don't want to do anything. But sometimes we do want to do something. You know, websites or web apps, you know, they don't really do much. They just sit there until the user does something of interest, like clicking a submit button or typing something. Now, the most common event that we want to react to is a click event. So let's try doing that. If the user clicks on this, we want to do something, right? So let's actually use this because it's going to be a click event on this heading element that we specifically want to react to. If I click here or here or here, we don't want to do anything. Only when we click on the heading element, let's say, right? So I still need this reference to that heading HTML element. So what we do to hook into that, we are going to add a so-called event listener, right? It will actually already show as a suggestion. So here we have to specify two arguments, right? Two inputs. The first one is which particular event do we want to listen for? Well, specifically the click event. This is the most common event, right? But could also be mouse enter event or mouse leave event, right? There are other events happening on this heading element, right? But the browser wants to know which particular one. Well, it's the click event. The second thing here, right? So a function can have multiple inputs. You know, we've seen one input here, but here we've actually seen two inputs as well, right? So a function can have multiple inputs. So the second input here is what we want to do when that event happens. So usually you want to run a couple of statements, right? So for example, maybe heading L, I want to change, I'm quickly going to do it with style. I want to change the color, right, to red, right? This is not a recommended way of doing it with style, but I'm just quickly doing it like this. And maybe in the second statement, I just want to log actually something to the console. I want to say change the color, right? So I want to run these two statements when the click event occurs. How do we specify that here? Can we just write it like this? Something like this? And no, this is actually not what you should do. What we should do is we should use a function, because remember what a function basically is. It's a way of grouping together statements, right? So we're going to create a function. I'll use the modern syntax here, and we'll put these statements in the function body, right? So the name that people usually use for these types of functions is the following. So you use the event name, right? Click in this case, and then usually people add handler, right? Because we're handling the event, right? So these functions are called event handlers. So the arrow function syntax is like this. And then we simply put these statements in the function body, right? Within the curly braces, right? And then we can run these two statements like this, click handler, right? If I want to run them, right? So the browser will go line by line in the script when it's executing the script. Once it gets to line 67, it will see, oh, we need to execute this function, meaning we need to run the statements inside of it. Now the common mistake people make, right? So now I want to specify here that it needs to run the click handler function when this event occurs, right? And you should write it like this, right? Now the common mistake that people make is they do this. The problem with this is the browser will go top from bottom, right? So it gets to line 60 and it sees, oh, we need to select this element, store it in this variable. Then it gets to these lines, and it will see, oh, we need to create a new variable, right? And it needs to be a function, right? With these statements. It will not run these statements. This is just a function, it's just a function specification. We're creating a function. And then we're getting to line 67, right? And here it sees, okay, so we need to listen for the click event, and then it sees this, right? So if we immediately call the function in here, if we now load the page, you can see it becomes red immediately. Even though I didn't click the heading, it still became red. And if we look at the console, it will also have logged this to the console, even though we didn't click it, right? So the event did not fire yet, right? But this happens because when the browser gets to line 67 here and it reads this statement here, it sees, right? It sees that we want to add an event listener, right? But then it also sees, oh, it wants to execute a function called click handler right now, right? So it's going to run the statements in the function body. And this means it's going to be red and it's going to log this. That's not what we want. We don't want to run it at the point of adding the event listener, right? We want to run it when the event occurs, right? So if we do this and I load the page, you can see it does not become red. It only becomes red when I click on it now, when the event actually occurs. That's when the browser will call the function and the statements in the function body will be run. All right, so that's everything I wanted to discuss. Don't worry if you didn't understand everything. In fact, I'm already expecting that some of this will be unclear to you. That's why I have 2 complete real-world projects for you that we're going to code together step by step. And let's just start doing that. I'll see you in project 1. Alright, that was it for this video. Hope that you learned a lot. Now, if you liked the video and you want to become a professional modern JavaScript developer, then definitely check out the full course. It has 2 beautiful real-world projects that we built from scratch, and you will learn much more like fetch and promises and async await, destructuring the spread operator, advanced JavaScript, how to structure or architect your project, modern front-end concepts like components, state and rendering, and much more. It's all in there. Check it out. The link is in the description. In any case, thanks for watching and I hope to see you soon.